"Your husband is dead," the man said. "Has been for 3 days. You have no claim here, no family, no money, and no one in this town who knows your name. Sign the paper and go home." Clara Whitmore stood in that office with 900 miles of travel on her boots and a marriage contract pressed against her chest, and she looked at Aldous Pitt the way a woman looks at a man who has badly miscalculated what she is made of. "I know my name," she said. "It's Mrs. Bacham, and I'm not signing anything." That was the night everything began. If you've ever been left with nothing in a place that doesn't know your name, you already know what Clara felt. Subscribe to this channel, follow her story all the way through, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled out before Clara had finished reading the notice nailed to the post outside the Dust Hollow land office. She heard the horses, heard the wheels crack against dry rock, and she didn't turn around. There was no point. There was nothing behind her anymore. Everything she had come from the cramped boarding house in Cincinnati, the 3 years of saving laundry money and mending fees. The careful handwritten letters exchanged with a man she had never once laid eyes on. All of it was behind her, pulling away in a cloud of Colorado dust. She read the notice a second time, then a third. Thomas Bacham, landowner and registered claimant of the Bacham Creek property, Dust Hollow Township, passed from this world on the 14th of October. His estate is currently under review pending legal determination of rightful succession. The 14th of October. Clara had been on a stagecoach the 14th of October, somewhere in the middle of Kansas, eating hard biscuits and watching the prairie flatten out toward the horizon. While she had been riding toward a life Thomas Bacham had already left his. She folded the notice carefully because she had learned young that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she walked through the door of the land office. The man behind the desk was named Aldous Pitt. She would learn that name inside of 2 minutes. He had the kind of face that seemed pleasant until you looked at it for longer than a greeting required, the smile that held its shape a beat too long, the eyes that moved over her trunk and her bag and her coat before they moved over her face. "Miss Whitmore," he said, as though he'd been expecting her, which meant someone had told him she was coming, which meant someone had been watching the stage. "Mrs. Bacham," Clara said. She said it steadily. Her voice did not shake. "I have a valid marriage contract witnessed and notarized in Cincinnati, dated September 3rd of this year." Pitt's smile did something complicated. "Well now, that's an interesting position to take." "It isn't a position, it's a legal document." He leaned back in his chair with the slow confidence of a man who believed that rooms belonged to him. "Miss Whitmore and I say that respectfully because you seem like an intelligent woman. Thomas Bacham did not file that contract here. Without local filing, the county doesn't recognize the union, which means you are legally speaking an unmarried woman with no claim to the Bacham estate." Clara set her traveling bag on the chair beside her. Not because she needed to rest it there, because she needed a second to breathe without it showing on her face. "Where is the estate attorney?" she asked. "There isn't one yet. That's being sorted." "Where is the will?" Something moved in Pitt's eyes. Fast. Gone before she could name it. "That," he said carefully, "is also being sorted." Clara picked up her bag. "I'll find my own accommodations. I'll be back with my document in the morning. I would like to speak to whoever is handling the legal proceedings." She walked out before he could speak again, because she had learned in 26 years of having very little that the moment you let a man like that control the length of a conversation, you had already lost something. Mitt. Dust Hollow was not what the letters had described. Thomas Bacham had written, or had someone write on his behalf, she now suspected, about a prosperous small town with good water and honest neighbors. What Clara found was a main street with 3 saloons, a church with a broken bell tower, a general store with credit rates posted on the door like a warning, and the particular quiet of a place where everyone knew everyone else's business and was currently learning hers. She felt the watching. It was a specific sensation, not the open curiosity of a town greeting a newcomer, but something more calculating. Eyes that measured rather than welcomed. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named May Dullen, who charged fair and asked no questions beyond whether Clara could pay the first week in advance. Clara could. Barely. She counted what remained after that payment and made herself look at the number honestly. Enough for perhaps 2 more weeks. 3 if she skipped meals. Not enough to absorb a prolonged legal fight. She needed work. She needed information. And she needed to understand exactly what she had walked into. May Dullen, it turned out, was both a source of the first and an unexpected supplier of the second. "You're the Bacham contract woman," May said that evening, setting a bowl of soup in front of Clara without being asked. "Word traveled faster than you did." "I imagine it did," Clara said. May sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded her hands. She was a woman somewhere past 60, with the kind of directness that came from having survived too much to waste time being indirect about anything. "There are 2 men in this town you need to watch," May said. "Aldous Puitt, whom I believe you've already met, and Gerald Hatch, who owns the Dust Hollow Savings, and holds the note on half the properties in this county. Thomas Bacham was behind on a loan payment when he died. Hatch has been moving to claim the property under default. Your arrival complicates his plans considerably." "My arrival," Clara said, "appears to complicate everyone's plans." "That's because you're alive," May said, as though this were a simple and significant fact. "A dead man's estate is easy to divide. A living woman with a contract is something else entirely." Clara looked at her soup. "Did Thomas Bacon have a will?" May was quiet for just a moment too long. "There was talk of a will," she said finally. "Filed with a lawyer named Wallace Gideon, who has an office 2 streets over. But there's also talk that Puitt has been to see Gideon twice in the past week, and nobody knows what those conversations were about." Clara set down her spoon. "What was Bacham like?" May considered the question seriously, the way honest people do when asked to characterize the dead. "He was a man who meant well and acted slowly," she said. "Not unkind, not sharp. He had good land and good water, and not enough sense to protect either. He trusted people he shouldn't have trusted, and he put things off that needed doing." She paused. "He put off filing that contract. He put off making the trip to Cincinnati to meet you. He put off a great many things, and now you're sitting in my kitchen paying the price for his delays." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "Did he know he was ill?" "He knew," May said quietly. "He knew for 2 months before the end." Clara absorbed that. Absorbed the fact that Thomas Bacon had known he was dying and had not written to release her from the contract, had not written to warn her, had not written at all, not in those final 2 months. She thought about what that meant, and she held the anger of it very carefully, because anger required energy, and she had a limited supply. "Thank you for the soup," she said. "There's more if you want it," May said. "And if you need work, the widow Carver runs the town laundry. She's not easy, but she pays on time and she doesn't ask questions." The next morning, Clara was back at the land office before Puitt arrived. She stood outside it in the October cold and waited because arriving second meant giving a man like Puitt the advantage of having already settled into his territory. He came up the street and stopped when he saw her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mrs. Bacham," she said. "Good morning. I'd like to see the record of land filings for the Bacham Creek property. That's a public record, and I'm entitled to review it." Puitt unlocked the office door without answering. She followed him in. He went to his desk. She stood at the counter and waited. "The records for that parcel," he said, opening a ledger with the unhurried movements of a man demonstrating control, "show Thomas Bacon as sole registered owner. No co-filing, no spousal addition, no record of any marriage contract." "I didn't ask if you had filed the contract. I asked to see the land record." He turned the ledger to face her. She read it. She noted the recording dates, the parcel boundaries, the water rights notation that ran alongside the land description. She noted the most recent entry dated 6 days ago, 4 days after Bacham's death, which showed a notation she didn't recognize. "What is this entry?" she asked, pointing. Puitt leaned across and looked at it with an expression of studied casualness. "Preliminary lien notation. Standard procedure when an estate enters probate without a clear heir." "Filed by whom?" A pause. Gerald Hatch acting as primary creditor. Clara straightened up. I see. Thank you. She turned toward the door. Miss Whitmore. His voice had shifted. Still pleasant, but with something underneath it now, something that wanted her to feel the size of the obstacle in front of her. I say this as someone who has seen this kind of situation before. A woman alone in a town she doesn't know with a document that isn't recognized locally. The sensible course is to cut her losses. There are men in this town who would offer a fair price for the inconvenience of her situation. Clara turned around slowly. Are you offering to buy my contract, Mr. Puit? I'm offering perspective. Your perspective, she said, is noted. She pulled the door open. I'll be visiting Mr. Gideon this morning. I expect his perspective will differ. She left him standing in the cold air that came through the open door and didn't look back. She almost didn't see the man leaning against the post outside the land office until she was nearly past him. He was tall and still in the way of a man who had learned that stillness communicated more than movement. A sheriff's star on his coat, a face that had been weathered into something quiet and watchful. He wasn't watching her with the measuring look she'd grown used to in the past 18 hours. He was watching the street. But he had heard. She knew he had heard. Mrs. Bacham, he said. She stopped. Sheriff? Ethan Cole. He didn't extend a hand, didn't push toward familiarity. I heard you arrived yesterday. Word travels, she said. In a town this size it does. He was quiet for a moment. A horse moved on the far end of the street. Puit say anything that concerned you? Clara looked at him directly. She had learned in her life to read the difference between a man who asked that question because he intended to help, and a man who asked it because he wanted to know how much she knew. Ethan Cole's face was unreadable in the way of a man who had practiced being unreadable, but his eyes were calm, in a way that wasn't performance. He suggested I had no legitimate claim, and that the sensible course was to sell out. Cole nodded once as though this confirmed something he already knew. You're going to see Gideon, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. Gideon is honest, Cole said. Cautious, but honest. Tell him everything. Don't minimize what you have. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say, and then will say nothing further about. Clara studied him for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Cole looked at her steadily. Because Puit has been in that office 3 times this week, and Hatch has been in there twice, and Gideon is a man who can be worn down by pressure, if nobody's pushing from the other direction. He tipped his hat and walked on. Clara watched him go, and then walked the other direction toward Gideon's office, turning that over in her mind, the quiet specificity of it, the lack of sentiment, the information delivered clean and without agenda. Or without apparent agenda. She didn't trust appearances. But she filed the information carefully because information was currency she couldn't afford to waste. Wallace Gideon was a small, dry man with ink-stained fingers and the precise manner of someone who had spent decades caring about the exact weight of words. His office smelled of paper and old coffee. He stood when Clara entered a small dignity that she noticed, and he listened to her without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. She laid the contract on his desk. He read it. He read it again. This is properly executed, he said. Yes. Witness notarized dated. Yes. He set it down carefully. Mrs. Bacham, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it without acting on it immediately. He paused. Thomas Bacham came to see me 6 weeks ago. He was ill. He knew his time was limited. He had me draw up a will. Clara's hands were very still in her lap. In that will, Gideon continued, he named you as primary beneficiary of the Bacham Creek property and all associated water rights. He instructed that the marriage contract upon your arrival was to serve as proof of the intended union and grounds for the inheritance to transfer to you, regardless of whether the marriage had been formally completed. Where is that will? Clara asked. Gideon's jaw tightened. That is the difficulty. I have the will. I filed it and I have the original. But 2 days after Thomas's death, a second document appeared, a prior will dated 18 months ago, naming Aldous Puit as executor and leaving the property to be liquidated with proceeds going to settle debts. He paused. That earlier will had not been in my possession. I had never seen it. It appeared in the county records as though it had always been there. The silence between them was dense. Someone inserted a fraudulent document into the county record, Clara said. That is my strong suspicion, but suspicion requires evidence, and evidence requires time, and in the meantime, Hatch has filed a lien and Puit is positioned as executor of a will that didn't exist last week. Yes, Clara stood. She walked to the window. She thought about 900 miles and 3 years of savings, and a dead man who had known he was dying and had done what he could imperfectly, incompletely, but with intention. She thought about the water rights notation in the land record. She thought about what May Dullen had said, good land and good water. She turned around. Can the second will be challenged? It can, Gideon said. If we can demonstrate that it was inserted after the fact. If we can find a witness to the circumstances of the original will's execution. If we can establish that your contract was the operative document Thomas intended to rely on. What do you need from me? Gideon looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Time, he said. A few weeks to build the record. And your patience because they will try to move faster than that. They're already moving faster than that, Clara said. Hatch filed that lien 6 days after the death. They've had weeks of preparation while I was on a stagecoach. I know. Gideon was quiet. Which is why I need you to be careful. They will look for pressure points, things that could be used to discredit you or destabilize your position. A woman alone in a frontier town without resources or allies is vulnerable, Clara said. I know what I am, Mr. Gideon. I've known for most of my life. She picked up her contract from his desk. I'd like you to file an official response to the Hatch lien by end of day today. On behalf of Clara Bacom, legal beneficiary under Thomas Bacom's will of October 2nd. Gideon blinked. That will provoke an immediate response. Yes, she said. It will tell me what they're willing to do when pushed. Better to know now than to find out when I'm less prepared. She put the contract back in her bag, snapped the clasp, and looked at him steadily. Can I rely on you, Mr. Gideon? He held her gaze. And something in him settled the way a man settles when he has been given the opportunity to be what he always meant to be. Yes, he said. You can. She found work at the laundry that afternoon. Martha Carver was exactly what May had described sharp, unsentimental fare. She looked at Clara's hands, asked if she'd done laundry work before, received an honest answer of yes, and gave her a start time of 6 in the morning. I don't allow trouble in my establishment, Martha said. Whatever is happening with the Bacom property, and yes, I've heard everyone has heard, it stays outside my door. Understood, Clara said. You're not afraid, Martha observed with the tone of someone noting a fact rather than offering a compliment. I'm terrified, Clara said honestly. But terror isn't useful unless you let it sharpen you. Martha looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted the way May Dullen's had shifted a recognition between women who had survived things of a familiar vocabulary. 6 o'clock, Martha repeated and walked back inside. It was nearly dusk when the two men found her on the road between the laundry and May's boarding house. She heard them before she saw them, the particular cadence of men who had decided something and were walking with that decision already made. She recognized one of them, Gerald Hatch, heavier than she'd imagined from May's description, with a banker's coat and the controlled manner of a man who had learned to make threats sound like advice. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mrs. Bacom, she said. The repetition had become almost automatic, a small flag planted every time because consistency mattered. Hatch smiled with one side of his mouth. Word is you've engaged Gideon and you're planning to contest the estate. That's correct. I wonder if anyone has explained to you the full scope of what that involves." He moved a half step closer, not a threat exactly, but a demonstration of spatial confidence. "Thomas Bacon owed my bank $430. That debt is secured against the property. Even if you were to succeed in your claim, which I consider unlikely, you would inherit a property encumbered by a debt you cannot pay. The debt," Clara said, "would need to be properly documented and verified by the court, which I look forward to doing." Hatch's eyes cooled. "You're a woman alone in a town you don't know with limited resources and no family. There's no version of this fight that ends well for you." "I appreciate your concern," she said. "It isn't concern," he said quietly. "It's courtesy. Walk away now, and I'll see you get $30 for your trouble and a seat on the next stage east." $30. She had traveled 900 miles, and he was offering her $30 to turn around and call it fair. "Good evening, Mr. Hatch," she said, and walked past him. She felt the weight of his stillness behind her, the kind of stillness that was a decision being made. Her spine was rigid, and her breathing was controlled, and she kept walking without varying her pace by a single step. She heard a voice from across the street. "Hatch." One word low and level. Ethan Cole standing in the deep shadow of an awning across the road watching. Not moving toward them. Not raising his voice. Just present and visible and known. The stillness behind Clara shifted. She heard Hatch's footsteps moving away in a different direction. She did not turn around to look at Cole. She kept walking. But she noted the deliberate placement, the economy of intervention, the understanding that sometimes presence is more effective than action. He hadn't rescued her. She hadn't needed rescuing. But he had altered the calculation, and that was something different. That was something she would think about later when she was alone in her room at May Dullen's boarding house, listening to the wind move across the Colorado dark and trying to find a foothold in everything she didn't yet know. She set her bag on the narrow bed and took out her contract and her small notebook and her remaining money, and she laid them out in front of her the way a general lays out a map. She had a lawyer she believed she could trust. She had work that would sustain her for now. She had a sheriff who was watching something she didn't fully understand yet, and watching it in her direction. She had a fraudulent will, to prove fraudulent a debt to contest, and two men who had already decided she was an obstacle to be removed. She also had, for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into the Colorado cold, the quiet conviction that she was not going to be removed. She wrote 3 things in her notebook. Get a copy of the debt documentation from Hatch's bank. Find who witnessed the prior will. Learn what Thomas Bacon was afraid of in the last 2 months of his life. Then she blew out the lamp and lay back in the dark and let the terror run through her the way you let cold water run through a wound necessary, painful, and then done. Tomorrow she would begin. Clara was at the laundry by 6 the next morning with her sleeves already rolled before Martha Carver unlocked the back door. She didn't wait to be shown what to do. She found the sorting table, found the first pile, and started working. Martha watched her for 30 seconds and said nothing, which Clara understood as approval. The work was hard and hot and exactly what she needed. Her hands knew what to do without her mind's permission, which left her mind free to move through everything she had learned and everything she still didn't know. She sorted and lifted and wrung and thought, and by the time the first hour was done, she had organized her situation into its parts with the same methodical clarity she had applied to her notebook the night before. The fraudulent will was the center of everything. Without it, Pweet had no standing as executor. Without Pweet's standing, Hatch's lien became a simple creditor claim, subject to normal probate procedure. Without that lien holding priority, her contract and Thomas's legitimate will gave her the property outright. The architecture of what had been done to her was clear. What was less clear was how to dismantle it fast enough. She was deep in that thinking when one of the other laundry women, a wide, steady woman named Bess, who had been working at Carver's for 4 years, set a cup of water on the edge of the table beside her. "You're the Bachem woman," Bess said. Not an accusation, just a fact being confirmed. "I am," Clara said. "My husband worked Bicham's south pasture last spring. Thomas paid him fair and on time. Bess picked up her own work without looking at Clara. Peewit tried to get my husband to sign something 2 days after Thomas died. Some kind of statement about Thomas's state of mind in his last weeks. My husband told him no. Clara's hands slowed. What kind of statement? That Thomas was confused, forgetful, not reliable in his thinking. Bess's voice was even and deliberate. Peewit wanted names. People who could testify that Thomas wasn't of sound mind when he signed documents late in his life. The calculation of it landed on Clara like cold water. If Thomas had been of unsound mind, the second will, the real one, the one Gideon held, could be challenged as invalid regardless of the fraudulent prior document. It was a secondary strategy, a fallback. If the forged will failed in court, they would attack the legitimate one. Your husband refused, Clara said. My husband, Bess said, is not a man who puts his name on things that aren't true. A pause. There are others who weren't as firm. Peewit has money and patience, and he's been at this for a while. Clara set down the sheet she was holding and looked directly at Bess. Would your husband be willing to speak to Wallace Gideon? Bess looked back at her with the measuring calm of a woman who had thought this through before bringing it up. He might, she said. If someone asked him properly. I'll ask him properly, Clara said. What's his name? Roy Calder. Bess went back to her work. He drinks coffee at the general store at 7 every morning before he goes out. He's not hard to find. Clara was at the general store at 7 the following morning. Roy Calder was a rangy, sun-darkened man of 50 with deliberate hands and the unhurried speech of someone who chose words carefully because he understood they had weight. She introduced herself, and he nodded and poured her a cup of coffee, without being asked, which she took as a good sign. She laid it out for him plainly. No dramatics, no appeal to sympathy. Just the facts as she understood them and what she needed. He listened the way serious men listen without his face giving anything away until she was finished. Then he looked at his cup. Thomas Bacon was of sound mind, Roy said. Right up to the last 3 weeks when the illness took him hard and fast. Before that he was slow and careful the way he always was, but he was clear. He turned the cup in his hands. I was there the day he rode out to the south pasture fence line and told me he'd sent for a woman from Cincinnati and he was going to do right by her. That was September. He was sharp as a new nail that day. Would you say that to Gideon? Clara asked. I would say it in open court, Roy said with the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided this before she asked. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and breathed once slowly. It was the first solid piece of ground she had found since stepping off the stagecoach. There's something else, Roy said. He was looking at the table. Thomas told me that day that he'd already signed the new will with Gideon. Told me he'd named his bride as beneficiary and that he was settled on it. Said he felt better with it done. Roy looked up. He also said that Hatch had been pressing him about the loan. That Hatch had made a comment about how the property would be easier to deal with if Thomas didn't have a widow complicating things. The room went very quiet in Clara's head. He said that directly? She asked. He said Hatch had said that a man dying without a wife on record was a cleaner situation for everyone. Roy's jaw tightened. Thomas laughed it off. Said he thought it was an odd thing to say. I didn't think it was odd at all. I thought it was a man telling Thomas exactly what he planned to do. Clara set down her cup. The picture was complete now, not all the evidence, not all the proof, but the full shape of the thing. Hatch had known about the marriage contract, had known Thomas was dying, had positioned himself to move the moment Thomas was in the ground, counting on Clara either not arriving or arriving too late and too unsupported to fight. He had miscalculated on both counts. Roy, she said, I need you to write down exactly what you just told me. Everything Thomas said about Hatch, about the will, about the date. I need a written signed statement for Gideon. I can do that today, Roy said. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it without hesitation, man to man, which was the only way she had ever wanted to be treated. She was back at Gideon's office before noon with Roy's statement in hand. Gideon read it twice, and when he set it down, his expression had changed the cautious wariness of the day before, replaced by something tighter and more focused. "This is significant," he said. "There's more." Clara told him about Puit's campaign to collect statements about Thomas's mental state. Gideon's eyes sharpened with each word. "That explains something," he said. He turned to a stack of papers on his desk and pulled out a single sheet. "I received this morning, a petition filed by Puit in his capacity as executor requesting a court date to establish probate under the prior will. He wants a hearing in 12 days. 12 days. Clara absorbed that. "That's not enough time," she said. "No," Gideon agreed. "It's designed not to be. 12 days barely gives us time to file a formal objection, let alone build the evidentiary record we need." He paused. "However, the filing of Roy Calder's statement today changes our position. We can now file a counter-petition challenging both the validity of the prior will and Puit's standing as executor. That forces the judge to address both documents before proceeding. Can we delay the hearing? We can petition for more time. Whether the judge grants it depends on who is hearing the case." He hesitated. "Judge Morris rides circuit. He's due in Dust Hollow in 11 days. He is a fair man, but he is also a man who likes order and dislikes complications. He will not be sympathetic to delay tactics." "Then we don't delay," Clara said. "We're ready in 12 days. What?" Gideon looked at her over the top of his papers. "Mrs. Bacon, to be ready in 12 days, I will need to establish the chain of custody on the fraudulent prior, will demonstrate that it was not in existence at the time of Thomas's death, obtain at minimum 2 additional witnesses who can speak to Thomas's intentions and mental state, and compile a full accounting of the Hatch loan to challenge its claimed priority." "Then we start today," Clara said. "What do you need me to do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a second sheet of paper and began writing a list. The next 8 days were the hardest of Clara's life, and she had known hard days. She worked the laundry from 6 to noon each day, because she couldn't afford to stop. She needed the money, and she needed the cover of routine, because a woman who appeared to be simply working and surviving was less threatening than one who was visibly building a legal case. She ate what May gave her, and slept 5 hours and spent everything between on the work Gideon assigned. She spoke to 6 more people who had known Thomas Basham. 4 of them were willing to give statements about his character and mental clarity. 2 of them told her something else, that Puit had visited them in the days since her arrival, not to collect statements this time, but to suggest that backing the Cincinnati woman was a risky proposition in a town where Hatch held the notes on a great many things. She brought that information to Ethan Cole. She didn't plan to. She had been walking back from the 4th interview, running the conversation over in her mind, and she came around the corner of the feed store and nearly walked into him. He reached out and steadied her by the arm, one hand brief, then gone, and looked at her with the direct attentiveness she had come to recognize as his mode of engagement. "You look like you're carrying a lot," he said. "I am," she said. And because she was tired, and because his assessment was accurate, and because she had stopped having the energy to be strategically guarded with everyone she told him about Puit's visits to her potential witnesses. Cole listened without comment. His face did that thing. It did absorbed information without transmitting reaction. "Who did he visit?" Cole asked. She named 2 of them. Cole nodded slowly. "What he's doing could be characterized as witness intimidation. It's a line, and he's walking right up to it." He paused. "I can't act on that unless someone files a complaint." "Would a complaint from me carry weight? With Judge Morris?" "Yes. He has no patience for procedural manipulation." Cole looked at her steadily. "But filing that complaint puts you more openly in Puit's sights. He'll know you're watching him specifically." "He already knows that," Clara said. Cole almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a shift in the line of his mouth. "File the complaint with my office. I'll witness it." She went to his office that afternoon and filed the complaint. He asked her questions about each incident with the same methodical care he seemed to apply to everything precise, unhurried, thorough. She answered each one directly. When they were done, he stamped the document and handed her a copy. "You should know," he said as she was rising to leave, "that I've been asking questions of my own about the prior will." Clara sat back down. "There are only two people who could have inserted that document into the county record," Cole said. "The county clerk whose name is Farley Birch, and whoever Birch might have let into the record room after hours." He paused. "Birch bought a new horse 3 weeks ago, paid cash. He makes $32 a month. The weight of that settled between them." "That's your evidence," Clara said. "Not evidence. Observation. But Gideon should know it, and he should ask Birch directly in a formal legal context where lying has consequences." "You've been building this case," Clara said. "Not an accusation, just a recognition." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching this town do something wrong to someone who didn't deserve it," he said. "That's my job." "Has it always been this complicated?" she asked. He looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man who was deciding how much truth to offer. "No," he said. "It got this complicated when Hatch started buying up debt, and Pweet started working for him. 4 years ago, this was a different kind of town." Clara looked at him. "Why are you still here?" Cole turned to look at her, and for the first time his face was fully open, something tired and stubborn and honest underneath the control. "Because someone has to be," he said. She held that for a moment. Then she picked up her copy of the complaint and stood. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "Ethan," he said quietly. She paused at the door. She didn't turn around, but she said it. "Thank you, Ethan." On the 9th day, everything shifted. Gideon sent word asking her to come immediately, and she arrived to find him standing at his desk with a document she didn't recognize thicker than the ones she had seen before, with official stamps along its margin. "What is this?" she asked. "Hatch's loan documentation," Gideon said. His voice had a new quality-controlled excitement underneath the caution. "I obtained a copy through the court's discovery process. Mrs. Bacham, look at this." He pointed to a line near the bottom of the second page. Clara leaned in and read. The loan amount was $430 as Hatch had said. The security was the Bacham Creek property. But the interest rate, she read it twice to be certain, was 41% annually, compounding quarterly. "That's usury," she said. "Under Colorado territorial law," Gideon said, "any loan carrying an interest rate above 24% per annum is legally void and unenforceable as written. The entire loan agreement is invalid." He paused. "Which means there is no debt. There is no legitimate lien. Hatch has been filing on a document that has no legal standing." The room was very still. "He knew," Clara said. "He had to know. He's been operating this way with other borrowers in the county for years. Most of them don't have lawyers. Most of them don't know to look." Gideon straightened up, and his voice was firm in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. "This is not a small discovery. This changes the entire evidentiary picture for the hearing." Clara pressed both hands flat on the edge of his desk. She breathed through the rush of it, the relief, the vindication, and underneath both of those, the cold fury of understanding how many people Hatch had done this to before she arrived. "I want that entered as primary evidence," she said, "and I want Gideon to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office about the fraudulent prior will immediately, not in 12 days, today. Filing today will alert Pweet and Hatch that we have this," Gideon said carefully. "Good," Clara said. "Let them know we have it. Let them spend the next 3 days trying to figure out what else we have." She looked at him directly. "Scared men make mistakes, Mr. Gideon. I need them scared." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his pen. The mistake came on day 11. Clara was walking from Mays to the laundry in the early gray light when she found Roy Calder waiting at the corner. His face told her something was wrong before he said a word. "They went to my wife," he said. His voice was flat with controlled anger. "Last night, Pweet came to my house after dark and told my wife that men who made enemies of Gerald Hatch in this county tended to find their credit called in and their contracts canceled. He paused. He told her I should consider withdrawing my statement before the hearing. Clara looked at him steadily. "Roy, what do you want to do?" "I want to testify," he said with the quiet iron of a man who has been pushed past a line he hadn't known existed. "I want to walk into that courtroom and say every word I told you in front of a judge on the record, and I want Pruitt sitting in the room when I do it." "Then that's what we'll do," Clara said. She went directly to Cole's office and told him about Pruitt's nighttime visit to the Calder home. Cole wrote it down without expression, but she saw his jaw tighten once the single involuntary sign. "Witness intimidation," he said, this time with a direct threat. "Yes." Cole stood. "I'll pay Pruitt a visit this morning." "What will you say?" Clara asked. "I'll tell him I know what he did last night, and I'll tell him that if he approaches any witness in this case again, I'll hold him until the judge arrives." He met her eyes. "And I'll tell him that I know about the county record room." Clara went very still. "You're going to show your hand." "I'm going to show enough of it," Cole said, "to make him believe we have more than we do, which we might." He reached for his hat. "Go to Gideon. Tell him to be ready. I think things are about to move fast." He was right. By afternoon, word had reached her through May, who heard everything worth hearing in Dust Hollow, that Pruitt had spent 3 hours behind the closed door of Hatch's office. That Farley Birch, the county clerk, had been seen leaving that same office, looking considerably less composed than when he entered. That 2 of Hatch's associates had ridden out of town in the direction of the county seat, which was a direction a man rode when he was either running or trying to get ahead of something. Clara sat at May's kitchen table that evening and let herself feel the shape of what had changed. 8 days ago, she had had a contract, a determination, and very little else. Now she had a lawyer who was engaged and competent. She had 3 witnesses prepared to testify. She had evidence of a usurious and legally void loan. She had a sheriff who was not neutral, and she had rattled 2 men enough that they were making the exact mistakes she had predicted. May set a plate in front of her without being asked. "You look different," May said. "Different how?" Clara asked. May considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "When you arrived, you looked like a woman who was afraid, but refusing to show it. Now you look like a woman who is afraid and doesn't care if it shows because the fear stopped being the point." Clara looked at her plate. "What's the point now?" "Winning," May said simply. Clara ate. Outside, the Colorado wind moved through the dark and the temperature dropped, and somewhere across town Pruitt and Hatch were spending the night trying to recover from a position that was supposed to have been unassailable. One more day until the hearing. One more day of holding everything together. She had come 900 miles for a life she had been promised. She had lost the man who promised it before she even arrived. She had been offered $30 and a seat on a stage east and told to call herself lucky. She thought about all of that sitting in May Dullen's kitchen with the warmth of the stove against her face, and one day left before everything came to a point. Then she finished her dinner and went upstairs and wrote in her notebook until the lamp ran low, and when she finally put it down and lay back in the dark, she did not need to run the fear through her the way she had that first night. The fear was still there, but it had changed its shape. It had become something she was carrying with her, rather than something that was carrying her. One more day. The morning of the hearing, Clara was dressed before the sun came up. She didn't sleep the last hour before dawn, just lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest, and ran through everything in sequence the way a soldier checks his weapons before a march. Roy Calder's statement, the usury evidence, Gideon's counter-petition challenging the fraudulent will, the complaint against Pruitt for witness intimidation logged with Cole's office and ready to be entered. Each piece in its place, each piece necessary, none of it individually decisive, all of it together a case she believed she could win. She believed it with the specific conviction of someone who has also considered every way it could fail. May had coffee waiting when she came downstairs. Neither of them said much. May pressed a hand briefly to Clara's shoulder when she stood to leave, and Clara nodded once, and that was enough. Some things didn't need words. The courthouse in Dust Hollow was a single large room attached to the back of the county clerk's building. It smelled of pine and old paper and the particular density of a space where people had been forced to sit still and feel things they didn't want to feel. Clara came in early and took a seat at the table Gideon had reserved on the left side. She set her folder down, folded her hands on top of it, and looked straight ahead. Pewitt came in 4 minutes later with a lawyer she hadn't seen before, a man from the county seat she suspected brought in for exactly this purpose, which told her something useful. You don't bring in outside counsel unless you're worried. Pewitt didn't look at her when he sat down. That told her something too. Hatch came in last. He sat in the gallery, not at counsel's table, positioned carefully as someone who was present but not party to the proceedings, a distinction that would not survive scrutiny if Gideon played the loan documentation correctly. Clara felt his eyes on her the moment he entered. She did not turn around. Ethan Cole stood at the back wall, not seated, standing with his arms loose at his sides and his hat in his hands, watching the room with the specific attention of a man who expected things to happen and had decided where he needed to be when they did. Judge Morris arrived, and the room stood and sat, and the hearing began. Pewitt's outside lawyer, a man named Cross, who had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to county seat courtrooms rather than frontier ones, opened with efficiency. The prior will dated 18 months before Thomas's death. Pewitt named executor. The estate to be liquidated to settle debts with Hatch's loan holding first priority. Clean, ordered. The kind of presentation that worked well when no one was pushing back. Gideon rose the moment Cross finished. Your Honor, we are filing a formal objection to the prior will on grounds of fraudulent insertion into the county record and a counter-petition establishing the validity of a subsequent will executed October 2nd of this year, naming Clara Bacon as primary beneficiary. Cross turned in his seat with practiced smoothness. Your Honor, the authenticity of the prior will has been properly established by its filing date. The filing date, Gideon said without raising his voice, is the very point of contention. We have reason to believe that document was inserted into the record after Thomas Bacon's death, not before. Judge Morris was a lean, gray-haired man with reading glasses and the patient authority of someone who had heard a great many claims and learned to distinguish the ones worth taking seriously. He looked at Gideon over his glasses. That is a significant allegation, Counselor. Yes, Your Honor. We intend to support it. Morris looked at Cross. Proceed with your presentation. Objection is noted and will be addressed in turn. Cross continued. He was good, organized, smooth, occasionally persuasive. But Clara watched the judge, and she noticed the moment Morris began making notes, which was about 4 minutes in, which meant he was writing down questions rather than simply receiving information. Then Cross made his first mistake. He called Farley Birch. Clara kept her face still, but she felt Gideon go alert beside her, the slight change in his posture that she had learned to read over the past week as the physical signal that something important had just happened. Birch took the stand with the careful composure of a man who had rehearsed this. He testified that he had received the prior will for filing on the date shown in the record, that it had been delivered to his office by a representative of the Pewitt Estate Management, and that he had filed it according to standard procedure. Cross sat down. Gideon stood up. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke the specific kind of quiet that made the room lean in. Mr. Birch, Gideon said, you testified that the prior will was filed according to standard procedure. Can you describe for the court what standard procedure requires when receiving a will for filing? Birch answered. 2 witnesses to the delivery, a receipt issued to the delivering party, entry in the intake ledger with time and date. Thank you, Gideon said. Your Honor, I am entering into evidence the county clerk's intake ledger for the relevant date. I'd ask the court to note that there is no entry corresponding to the receipt of the prior will on the date claimed. The room shifted. Cross was on his feet immediately. The absence of a ledger entry is a clerical oversight. Or, Gideon said, still quiet, still level. It is evidence that the document was not received on that date at all. He turned back to Birch. Mr. Birch, you recently purchased a horse. A gray quarter horse sold by the Harmon stable. You paid $65 cash. Your monthly salary is $32. Can you explain the source of those additional funds? Birch's composure fractured. It wasn't dramatic, just a sudden tightness in his face. A hand that gripped the railing of the witness box too firmly. That's a personal financial matter. Your Honor, Gideon said, turning to Morris. We are prepared to argue that Farley Birch was compensated to insert the prior will into the county record after Thomas Bycomb's death, creating the appearance of a filing that predated the legitimate will I hold. The horse purchase and the absence of a ledger entry are 2 points of a larger pattern we will fully develop. Cross was standing and objecting, and Morris was tapping his desk for order, and in the middle of all of it, Clara heard from the gallery behind her the sound of Gerald Hatch standing up from his seat. She turned around for the first time. Hatch was standing, and his face controlled banker smooth. Gerald Hatch had something visible in it for the first time. Not panic, not yet, but the recognition of a man who has just discovered that the floor beneath him is not where he thought it was. Cole at the back wall had straightened. His eyes were on Hatch, not moving, just watching. Hatch sat back down. Morris gavelled for order and got it. I'm going to take a 10-minute recess, he said. When we resume, Counselor Cross, you will address the ledger discrepancy directly. And Mr. Gideon, you will have the opportunity to present your counter-evidence in full. In the 10-minute recess, Gideon gripped Clara's arm at the table and spoke quietly and fast. They didn't expect the ledger. Birch was supposed to be unassailable. He's a county official, his testimony carries weight, and Cross brought him assuming we wouldn't have documentation to counter him. Gideon's voice had an urgency he was keeping barely controlled. But now they know we have it, and they're going to adjust. Cross is going to come back in here and shift the attack to Thomas's mental state. That was always the fallback. Get ready. Roy is ready, Clara said. They may also attack you directly, Gideon said. Your character, your motives for coming here, the contract itself. Cross is good enough to try to make a legitimate marriage contract look like opportunism. Let him try, Clara said. Gideon looked at her for a moment. There is one thing I didn't tell you, he said, because I didn't want it to affect your preparation. He paused. Cross filed a motion this morning before the hearing. He's arguing that because the marriage was never formally completed, that Thomas died before you arrived, the contract cannot confer beneficiary status, that you are legally a stranger to the estate. Clara absorbed this. That's their real argument, she said. The prior will was a distraction, a way to tie up the proceedings while the primary attack was this. Yes, she thought about that for a moment. The contract specifies beneficiary rights contingent on arrival and intent to complete the union, not on formal completion. It does, Gideon said. I believe we can argue it successfully, but it's going to come down to the language of the contract and the judge's interpretation. Then let's make sure Morris understands exactly what that language means, Clara said. When the hearing resumed, Cross did exactly what Gideon had predicted. He dropped Birch visibly strategically without acknowledging the retreat and turned the entire presentation toward Thomas Bycomb's character and competence. He called a man named Doyle, who ran the feed store, who testified that Thomas had seemed distracted and forgetful in his last months, had confused orders twice, had appeared unwell. Gideon cross-examined. Mr. Doyle, you described Thomas Bycomb as distracted and forgetful. You're aware that he was ill. I heard he was sick, yes. A man who is dying of an illness might appear distracted to those around him, mightn't he? That wouldn't tell you anything about his legal competence. Doyle shifted. I suppose not. Did Thomas Bycomb ever fail to pay you, ever sign something you later had reason to believe he didn't understand? A pause. No. Thank you, Gideon said and sat down. Cross called one more character witness. Then Gideon called Roy Calder. Roy walked to the stand with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly what he is going to say and why it is true. He settled into the seat, looked at Gideon and waited. Gideon took him through it methodically. Thomas's clarity. The specific conversation about the will, the date, the content, Thomas's own words about having named his bride as beneficiary. Thomas's explicit reference to having signed documents he was settled on. Then Roy said the thing Clara hadn't known he was going to say. Thomas told me one other thing that day, Roy said. He wasn't looking at Gideon now. He was looking at the judge. He told me that Gerald Hatch had come to him 2 weeks before and offered to forgive the entire loan, the whole $430, if Thomas would agree to add Hatch as co-owner of the water rights. The gallery stirred. Thomas said no, Roy continued. He said the water rights were part of what he was leaving to his bride, and he wouldn't trade them for anything. Roy paused. He said Hatch didn't take it well. Clara heard Cross rise behind her. Objection. Your Honor, hearsay. Withdrawn, Gideon said smoothly. Mr. Calder, I have no further questions. He sat down and leaned to Clara's ear. The hearsay objection would have been sustained. But the jury, the judge heard it. He can't unhear it. Clara kept her face still. Her hands were flat on the table. Underneath the stillness, her heart was moving hard. Morris was making notes again. More notes than before. Then Cross stood and looked directly at Clara, and her name was called. She had known this was coming. She walked to the stand with her folder, and she sat down, and she looked at Cross the way she had learned to look at men who intended to diminish her directly, without hostility, without submission. Just a woman prepared to answer questions accurately. Cross began with the contract. He was precise and careful, and he asked questions designed to establish ambiguity, to create the impression that the language was unclear, that a contract signed in Cincinnati had no force in Colorado, that a woman who had never met her intended husband was a stranger to his estate in every way that mattered. Clara answered each question the same way she had answered everything in the past 2 weeks, factually directly, and with the specific language of the contract committed to memory so completely that she could cite page and paragraph. When Cross tried to suggest that she had arrived in Dust Hollow with predatory intentions, a word he never used, but circled for 10 full minutes of questioning, she looked at him calmly and said, I arrived with a valid legal document and the intention to begin a life I had been promised. The man who promised it died before I arrived. That is not a crime. That is a misfortune. I am asking this court to honor the legal instrument that governed that arrangement. Cross shifted his approach. Miss Whitmore, you had never met Thomas Bacon. No. You knew nothing of this town, this property, this community. I knew what was in the letters and the contract. And you traveled 900 miles based on documents exchanged with a man you'd never seen. Yes, Clara said. Because the documents were legally binding, witnessed and notarized, and because I had no reason to doubt their validity. She paused. I still don't. You stand to inherit property worth considerably more than the circumstances of your arrangement would suggest. Objection, Gideon said. Argumentative. Sustained, Morris said. Cross tried 2 more angles. Both of them failed against the specific exact language of the contract and Clara's ability to cite it. She watched him recalibrate each time the slight reset the new approach, and she felt underneath the pressure of the stand something she hadn't expected. Something close to calm. Because she had prepared for this. She had prepared for exactly this. And everything he was doing was inside the range of what she had anticipated, and none of it was landing. When Cross finished, Gideon rose for redirect. Mrs. Bycham, he said, the contract you hold specifies beneficiary rights contingent on arrival and intent to complete the union. Can you speak to your intent? I arrived in Dust Hollow on the morning of October 17th, Clara said. I had the contract in my possession and the full intention of completing the union it described. Thomas Bycham died 3 days before my arrival, not 3 days after. The intent existed. The arrival occurred. The only thing that prevented the formal completion was his death, which was beyond either party's control. And Thomas Bacon's will, Gideon said, names you as primary beneficiary by name, Clara Whitmore of Cincinnati. Is there any ambiguity in your understanding about who that document refers to? None, Clara said. She stepped down and walked back to the table and sat, and she kept her hands flat and her face still, and she breathed. Morris called a 30-minute recess. Sad. It was in that recess that Farley Birch broke. Clara didn't see it happen. She was in the hallway with Gideon going over the loan documentation for the final argument. But May told her later in the specific detail of someone who had been in the right place at the right time. Birch had gone into the small room off the side of the courtroom where Cross and Puet were conferring. Someone had raised a voice Puey by the sound of it, and Birch had come back out alone, and instead of returning to the gallery, he had walked directly to where Ethan Cole was standing in the corridor. He had talked to Cole for 7 minutes. May counted. When Clara and Gideon came back in from the hallway, Cole was standing at the front of the room with a folded piece of paper. He caught Gideon's eye and crossed to them. "Birch has given me a written statement," Cole said, his voice low and even. "He confirms that he was paid $80 to insert the prior will into the record on the night of October 16th. He names Puet as the party who paid him and Hatch as the party Puet was acting for." A pause. "He also states that Puet told him the prior will had been prepared in advance before Thomas's death and was being held until the timing was right." Gideon went very still. "Before Thomas's death, yes." The three of them stood in that, and what it meant assembled itself in Clara's mind, with the cold precision of something that had always been true but was now visible. They had not merely forged a document after Thomas died. They had prepared it while he was still alive. They had been planning this in specific detail before she ever boarded the stagecoach. They had known about the marriage contract, had known Thomas had made a will, had spent weeks building the architecture of a theft waiting only for a death that was already coming. "Enter it," Clara said. Her voice was steady in the way that steadiness sometimes is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something stronger. "All of it," Gideon said. He looked at Cole. "Can Birch testify?" "He will," Cole said. "He wants immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange. That's a matter for the territorial court, not this proceeding, but he'll testify." When Morris returned to the bench and the hearing resumed, Gideon entered Birch's statement into the record. Cross objected. Morris overruled. Cross objected again on different grounds. Morris overruled again, and this time his voice carried a quality that had not been there before, something compressed and final. Then Gideon stood and entered the loan documentation. "Your Honor, we are submitting the full text of the loan agreement between Gerald Hatch and Thomas Bycombe into evidence and asking the court to note that the interest rate stated in that agreement, 41% per annum compounding quarterly, exceeds the maximum rate allowable under Colorado territorial law by a factor of nearly 2. The loan as written is legally void and unenforceable. The lien filed against the Bacham estate has no valid basis." Cross stood. But for the first time since the hearing began, he didn't speak immediately. He stood at his table, and he looked at the document Gideon had just entered, and Clara watched him calculate the distance between where he had started the morning and where he was standing now. He had no argument. Not a good one. He made 3 objections in quick succession, all procedural, all denied. He sat down. In the gallery, Gerald Hatch stood up for the second time. This time, Ethan Cole pushed off the back wall and walked toward him. Not fast, not threatening, just steady and deliberate and present. Hatch sat back down. Morris removed his glasses and set them on the desk and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has been watching people make choices all day and has come to a determination about the quality of those choices. "I am going to review all submitted materials before issuing my ruling," he said. "That review will be completed by tomorrow morning. Both parties will present for ruling at 9 o'clock. He paused. "I will say this, any further attempt to contact, pressure, or discourage witnesses in this matter will result in immediate sanction and a referral to the Territorial Court for Criminal Proceedings." He looked directly at Puet when he said it. Puet did not look away, but his face had gone the particular color of a man who has realized he is exposed. The gavel came down. Clara did not move for a long moment after the room began to empty. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the folder, and she let the day drain through her, the pressure of the stand, the precision of every argument the moment Birch's statement came through the door and changed the weight of everything. Gideon was gathering papers beside her. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "We'll know tomorrow." "We already know," Clara said. "Not arrogance, something quieter than that. The specific knowledge of a woman who has built something carefully and watched it hold under pressure." Gideon looked at her and nodded once. She picked up her folder and walked to the back of the emptying room. Cole was there, hat in his hands, watching her come. "Birch," she said. "When did you know he was going to break?" "When Cross put him on the stand," Cole said. "Birch is not a brave man. He was counting on not being asked directly." The moment Gideon asked about the ledger, Birch understood that someone had been more careful than he'd been told to expect. A pause. He made a calculation. He decided that being on the right side of the truth was safer than being on the losing side of a lie. "Is he right?" Clara asked. Cole considered it honestly. "Probably," he said. "Hatch will try to make him a scapegoat. But with the loan documentation in the record, Hatch's own exposure is significant enough that he'll be managing his own situation." Clara nodded. Then she said, "What happens to Puiti?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what the territorial court decides to do with Birch's statement. What Puit did preparing a fraudulent document before a man's death, paying a county official to insert it afterward, that's not a civil matter." "No," Clara said. "It's not." She walked out of the courthouse into the Colorado afternoon, and the cold air hit her face, and she stood still for a moment, and just breathed it in, the particular sharp clarity of high country air, after a long time inside a closed room, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day without pushing it away. Tomorrow at 9 she would know, but she already knew. She had done everything she could do, and she had done it right, and now it was in the hands of a fair judge with an honest record in front of him. That was going to be enough. She walked back to May's boarding house in the late afternoon light, and for the first time since she had arrived in Dust Hollow, she did not look over her shoulder once. She didn't sleep, not for lack of trying. She lay in the dark at May's boarding house and listened to the wind move through the October cold, and ran the hearing through her mind in sequence, every exchange, every objection, every moment when the room had shifted and she had felt the current change direction. She looked for the holes. The places where Cross might have found purchase if he'd pressed differently, where Morris might reasonably decide that what they had presented was compelling but not conclusive. She found two. The first was the contract language. Gideon was confident in his reading beneficiary rights contingent on arrival and intent not formal completion. But Morris was a judge, not an advocate, and judges were not required to share the interpretation of the lawyer presenting the argument. If Morris read the contract more narrowly, the entire inheritance question came back to the fraudulent prior will alone, which meant everything rested on Birch's statement and the ledger discrepancy. The second hole was Birch himself. A man who had sold his integrity for $80 and a new horse was not an unassailable witness. Cross would have spent last night building exactly that argument. She turned on her side. She turned back. At 4 a.m. she got up, lit the lamp, and wrote in her notebook until the sky began to pale. Not strategy. There was nothing left to strategize. Just the plain record of what had happened and what it had taken to get here, written in her own hand, because she had learned young that writing things down made them real, in a way that thinking them did not. May knocked at 5:30 with coffee and a look that asked the question without words. "I'm ready," Clara said. It was both an answer and a decision. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 and found Ethan Cole already there, standing outside the door with his hat on and his coat buttoned against the cold. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without the careful social management most men applied when they were uncertain what a woman needed from them. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No. Neither did Puit from the look of it." He nodded toward the far end of the street. "He was at the telegraph office at 6 this morning." Clara absorbed that. "Sending word to Hatch's people at the county seat? That would be my read." Cole paused. Whatever he sent, it's too late to change anything in that courtroom today. Morris already has the record. He's been in his room since last night. Cross. Left on the 8 o'clock stage. Cole said it quietly, watching her. Clara went still. He left. He left. No client notification on record, no request for delay. He simply got on the stage. A pause. That's a lawyer who has decided the ground under his client is not where he wants to be standing. The implications of that ran through Clara in a single cold current. Cross was not a man who abandoned paying clients without reason. Cross had reviewed everything in the record last night, all of it including Birch's statement and the loan documentation, and he had made a professional calculation that the cost of losing this case visibly was higher than the cost of the breach of contract Puig could bring against him, which meant Cross believed Morris was going to rule against them. Completely. Not a partial ruling, not a compromise, a full decision against Puig and Hatch. She breathed. Then it's over. Almost, Cole said carefully. Puig is still in there. He might represent himself, try to delay, make a procedural argument. Don't assume the morning is simple until Morris speaks. She nodded. She went inside. Puig was at his table alone, and the aloneness of it was visible, the extra space where Cross had sat, the absence of the practiced confidence that outside counsel had supplied. He was writing something when Clara sat down, and he didn't look up. But his pen stopped moving for a moment and then resumed, which told her he knew she was there and was deciding how to appear unbothered. He wasn't unbothered. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the specific tension of a man holding himself very carefully together. Gideon arrived at 8:40 with a leather case and the contained energy of someone who had also been awake and had used the time well. "Cross is gone," Clara murmured. "I know," Gideon said. He set his case down and opened it without looking up. "Morris will note the absence. It will inform his reading of the situation." He paused. "Are you prepared for any outcome?" "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her then. "The best outcome gives you the property outright. The second will upheld, the prior will, voided, the Hatch lien removed. The middle outcome upholds the second will, but requires us to address the loan debt through a separate proceeding. The worst outcome." "I know what the worst outcome is," Clara said. "I've been living with it for 2 weeks." Gideon nodded. "Then we're ready." Morris came in at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room stood and sat, and the last proceeding began. Morris did not waste time. He set his papers in front of him and looked at Puig's empty side of counsel table with the expression of a man noting a fact without commenting on it. Then he looked at Clara and Gideon. "Before I deliver my ruling," Morris said, "I want to address a procedural matter. Mr. Cross is no longer present in this proceeding. Mr. Puig, are you prepared to represent yourself? Or do you require a continuance to obtain new counsel?" Puig stood. He was composed, she gave him that. Whatever he was feeling, he had organized it into a functional presentation. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor." Morris studied him for a moment with the flat attention of a judge who has seen men make this decision before and knows what it usually means. "Very well. I'll allow limited opportunity for response after I deliver my findings. Be seated." He opened his papers. "I have reviewed the full record of submitted evidence in this matter, including the counterpetition filed by counsel for Clara Bacon, the testimony presented during yesterday's hearing, and the written statement obtained by Sheriff Cole from County Clerk Farley Birch." He paused. "I want to address each contested point in turn." Clara's hands were flat on the table. She did not move. On the matter of the prior, will dated 18 months before Thomas Bacon's death, and filed under Aldous Puig's name as executor. The absence of a corresponding entry in the county clerk's intake ledger for the claimed filing date is not standing alone conclusive. Ledger errors occur. However, the absence of a ledger entry combined with the written statement of the clerk himself, who has acknowledged under signed oath that he was compensated to insert the document into the record on the night of October 16th. 4 days after Thomas Bacon's death, constitutes substantial evidence of fraud upon this court. Morris looked up briefly. Substantial is a measured word. I use it deliberately. He returned to his papers. The prior will is voided. It has no legal standing in this proceeding or any subsequent proceeding. The gallery stirred. Clara heard it as though from a distance. On the matter of the subsequent will executed October 2nd of this year before Wallace Gideon as witness and notary, the will is properly executed, properly preserved, and properly entered into evidence. The testimony of Roy Calder corroborates both the will's existence and Thomas Bysham's clear intent at the time of execution. I find no credible evidence of mental incapacity that would invalidate this document. He turned a page. The second will is upheld. Thomas Bysham's expressed intent is recognized as legally operative. Clara felt something move in her chest. Not relief, not yet because there was still the contract question, but the specific sensation of a weight that has been pressing for weeks, easing by degrees. On the matter of the marriage contract, and Clara Whitmore Bacon's standing as beneficiary opposing counsel, raised the argument that the failure to formally complete the marriage negated the contract's force. I have reviewed the contract language carefully. Morris paused. The contract specifies in its beneficiary provisions that the rights therein vest upon the arrival of Clara Whitmore in Dust Hollow with intent to fulfill the contract's terms. It does not require formal completion of the union as a prerequisite to those rights. It requires arrival and intent. He looked up. Mrs. Bacham, you arrived on October 17th with the contract in your possession and every expressed intention of fulfilling its terms. Thomas Bysham's death on October 14th was not a failure of intent by either party. It was a fact beyond both parties' control. Clara breathed. The contract is valid. Clara Bacham is recognized as primary beneficiary under Thomas Bysham's will of October 2nd. The Bacon Creek property, including all associated water rights transfers to her ownership. There was a sound in the gallery, not applause. Nothing that dramatic, but the particular release of breath that a room makes when tension that has been held a long time is suddenly no longer required. Then Morris's voice came again, and it was harder. On the matter of the Hatch loan and the lien filed against the Bacham estate, the loan documentation entered into evidence establishes an interest rate of 41% per annum, compounding quarterly. This rate exceeds the maximum allowable rate under Colorado territorial law by a factor approaching 2. The loan agreement as written is legally void. He paused. The lien has no valid basis. It is removed from the record effective today. At the table across from her, Puit had gone very still. Finally, Morris said, and his voice carried something beneath the judicial formality. Now something compressed and deliberate. I am referring the matter of the fraudulent will, the compensation of a county official, and the witness intimidation documented in complaints filed with Sheriff Cole's office to the Territorial Court for criminal investigation. The referral will include the full record of this proceeding. He looked directly at Puit. Mr. Puit, do you have any response to the findings as stated? Puit stood. He was pale, but his voice when it came was controlled. Your Honor, I would respectfully request a review of the findings are issued, Morris said. A request for review requires written filing within 30 days and will be addressed by the Territorial Court, which will also be handling the criminal referral. This proceeding is concluded. The gavel came down. Clara did not stand immediately. She sat at the table while the room moved around her, Gideon gathering papers, with hands that were not entirely steady, the gallery shifting and murmuring. Puit walking out with the careful movements of a man under significant internal pressure. She sat, and she held the ruling in her mind and let it become real. The property was hers. The water rights were hers. The fraudulent apparatus that had been built to take them from her before she even arrived had been dismantled in open court on the record by a fair judge with the evidence she and Gideon and Cole had spent 12 days assembling. Thomas Bysham had tried to do right by her. He had done it imperfectly, incompletely, with the delays of a man who put things off. But he had made a will that named her. He had sent for her. He had told Roy Calder on a September afternoon with the clarity of a dying man who knew exactly what he wanted, that he was going to do right by his bride. She thought about that man she had never met, slow and careful, and not sharp enough to protect himself, as May had said, and she felt for the first time something for him that was not anger at the delays and the silences and the uncompleted journey. Something that was closer to gratitude. He had tried. "Clara." Gideon's voice was quiet beside her. She looked up. "You won," he said, plainly, without ornamentation. "We won," she said. He shook his head. "I built the case. You built the foundation. There's a difference." She found Cole outside, standing in the same position he had been in when she arrived, hat in his hands, watching the street with the patient attention he seemed to apply to everything. "Morris ruled in full," she said. "I heard he said the wall between the room and the corridor was not thick. The referral to Territorial Court Puit and Hatch will be dealt with there," Cole said. "It won't be fast, and it won't be simple, but it's on the record now, and territorial prosecutors don't ignore records like that." He paused. "Hatch will have lawyers by the end of the week. He'll argue financial technicalities and try to separate himself from Puit's actions. It may take a year." "But it will happen," Clara said. "Yes," Cole said. "It will happen." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had stood at the back of every room she'd been in for 2 weeks, positioning himself precisely where he needed to be, giving her what she needed before she always knew she needed it. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Not the way she'd asked in his office when she was still measuring whether he could be trusted. A different question now, with different stakes. Cole was quiet long enough that she knew he was deciding how honest to be. "Because what they were doing was wrong," he said. "That's the simple answer, and it's true." "What's the less simple answer?" He turned to look at her fully. "Because you walked into that land office on your first morning here and told Puit your name was Mrs. Bacham, and you said it like you'd decided something and weren't going to be moved. And I thought—" He stopped. "I thought that kind of person deserved to have someone in their corner who wasn't going to be moved either." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. The same words as before at the same door, but weighted differently now. "You're welcome, Clara," he said, the first time he had used her given name. The days that followed had a different quality than any she had known since arriving. Not easy. There was nothing easy about taking possession of land you'd never seen in a town that had just watched a legal battle reshape its power structure. But solid. Each day had a foundation under it that the previous weeks had lacked. She rode out to the Bacom Creek property with Gideon on a gray morning 3 days after the ruling, and she stood at the fence line and looked at the land Thomas had left her and tried to feel what she was supposed to feel. It didn't come all at once. It came in pieces over the following days as she walked the fence lines and talked to the 2 ranch hands who had stayed on without pay through the uncertainty, men named Holt and Pruitt, who had worked the property for years and who looked at her with the specific wariness of people who have learned not to trust quickly, but who are prepared to revise their assessment with evidence. She gave them evidence. She paid them. Full wages for the weeks they'd worked without. She asked Holt to walk her across every inch of the property and explain what he knew about it, and she listened without interrupting, and she asked questions that told him she was paying attention. On the 3rd day, he stopped looking at her with wariness and started looking at her with the cautious respect of someone who has discovered that a person is more competent than expected. Pruitt took longer. He was a man who had been burned before and wore the evidence of it in the set of his jaw. On the 5th day, when Clara was working on the fence line herself, instead of watching him work it, he came and worked beside her, without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. "You're staying," he said finally. Not a question. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded and went back to work, and that was the end of his skepticism. May Dullen came out to the property on the 4th day with a basket and the direct manner of a woman making an inspection she had decided was warranted. She walked through the house, small, spare, well-built, and into the kitchen, and stood at the window and looked out at the land with the expression of someone who is doing a private calculation. "Thomas bought this land for the water," May said. "Most of this county runs dry by August. His creek doesn't." She turned around. "Hatch knew that. It's why he wanted it. A man who controls the water in a dry county controls everything." "I know," Clara said. "What are you going to do with it?" Clara had been thinking about this since the ruling. She had thought about it walking the fence lines with Holt. Thought about it lying awake listening to the creek run in the dark. "The ranchers to the north have been paying Hatch above market rates to access his irrigation ditches," she said, "because they have no other option. I'm going to offer them access to the Bacham Creek water at a fair price, below what Hatch charged. Enough for me to maintain the property, and enough for them to keep their operations solvent." May looked at her. "That will make you allies of half the county," May said. "That's the idea," Clara said. May set down the basket on the kitchen table and opened it, and there was bread and preserves and the business-like warmth of a woman who approves of something and expresses it through provisions. "You'll need to be careful about how you present it," May said. "These are proud men. They won't want to feel like they're taking charity from a woman who beat their neighbors in court." "It isn't charity," Clara said. "It's a fair business arrangement. I'll make sure they understand the difference." "Make sure you make it their idea," May said. "Men are easier to work with when they think the good sense was theirs." Clara almost laughed. It was the first time she had come close to laughing in 3 weeks. Roy Calder came by on the 6th day with a practical offer his knowledge of the South Pasture drainage issues in exchange for access to the creek for his own small operation. Clara accepted without hesitation. By the end of the week, 2 other ranchers had sent word through Roy asking about water arrangements. The architecture of it was assembling itself faster than she had planned, which was the way things sometimes worked when the foundation was right. She was at the fence line on the 8th day when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to find Ethan Cole riding toward her with no particular urgency, the way a man rides when he has no professional purpose, and is making no attempt to disguise the fact that the direction he chose was deliberate. He dismounted and stood at the fence and looked at her work. "That corner post is going to need resetting before winter," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm getting to it." He stood with his arms on the fence rail and looked out at the land with the ease of someone who has been in open country his whole life and is comfortable in the specific silence of it. "The territorial prosecutor sent word," he said after a moment. "Puit has been summoned. Hatch has retained 2 lawyers from Denver." He paused. "It's going to be a proper fight." "Let it be," Clara said. "You may be called as a witness." "Good," she said. "I have things to say." Cole was quiet for a moment. A horse moved somewhere in the pasture behind her. The creek ran. The October cold was settling into a different quality, the first real edge of approaching winter, the kind of cold that had intention in it. "You've changed things here," Cole said. It wasn't flattery. It was an observation delivered with the same directness he applied to everything. "I just defended what was mine," Clara said. "That's not nothing," he said, "in a town where most people don't." She looked at him. He was looking at the land still, and she studied the profile of him, the weathered patience of his face, the steadiness that had been a constant in 3 weeks of nothing being steady. And she felt the specific awareness of a woman who has been so focused on survival that she has not permitted herself to notice certain things and is now, with the pressure lifted, noticing them. "What do you do," she asked, "when you're not standing at the back of courtrooms and arriving at the right moment on dark streets?" He turned to look at her with the slight shift in expression that she had learned to read as the closest he came to surprise. "I have a small place north of town," he said. "I run a few head. Nothing serious." A pause. "Most of what I do is what you've been watching me do." "Being present," she said. "Being present," he agreed. She turned back to the fence post and tested it with both hands loose as he'd said. She would need to reset it before the ground froze solid. "I'm having Roy and two of the North ranchers for supper on Friday," she said, "to discuss the water arrangement." She was looking at the post. "You should come." He was quiet for a moment. "What time?" he said. 6 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. He remounted with the easy economy of a man who has done it 10,000 times and turned the horse toward town, and she listened to the hoofbeats until they faded. And then she went back to work with the particular focus of someone who has been given something small and good to look forward to. That evening she sat at the kitchen table of her own house, her land, her creek running in the dark outside the window, and she wrote a letter to an old friend in Cincinnati. She wrote about the journey, and the fraud, and the hearing, and the ruling. She wrote about Gideon, and Roy Calder, and May Dullen. She wrote about Ethan Cole briefly and carefully, in the measured way of someone who is still deciding how much weight a thing has. Then she folded the letter, and set it aside, and picked up her notebook, and added one line at the bottom of the last page of everything she had written since arriving in Dust Hollow. "I am no longer afraid." She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and blew out the lamp, and she slept fully deeply, without running anything through her mind, for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach and found herself alone in a town that had wanted to take everything from her. Outside, the Colorado dark held the property in its cold quiet, and the creek ran on indifferent and clean and entirely hers. Friday came with the particular cold of a Colorado November that had stopped pretending to be autumn. Clara had the stove going by 4 in the afternoon and the table set by 5, and she was aware in the back of her mind that she was more deliberate about these preparations than the occasion strictly required. Roy Calder and 2 ranchers coming for supper to discuss a water arrangement did not require the good plates. She used them anyway, and she didn't examine why too carefully. Holt came in from the barn at 5:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who has noticed something and is deciding whether to comment on it. "6 people for supper," he said. "6." Clara confirmed. "Sheriff's coming," he said. Not a question. "He is." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's a good man," with the plain directness of someone delivering information he considers relevant, and went back outside. Clara stood at the stove and said nothing because there was nothing to say to that, and also because Holt was right, and she already knew it. Roy arrived first with his wife, a woman named June, who had her husband's steadiness and her own brand of directness that made Clara like her immediately. The 2 North ranchers, a man named Aldous Price and his partner Clem Wakefield, came 5 minutes later, both of them carrying the specific wariness of men who had been on the losing side of a water arrangement for long enough that being offered a better one felt like a trap. Clara fed them first. She had learned from May Dullen that men who are fed are easier to work with than men who are hungry, and that a table that has seen generosity creates a different kind of conversation than a table that has seen nothing but business. Ethan Cole arrived at 6, exactly which she had expected, and when he came through the door and took off his hat and looked at the room at Roy and June and the 2 ranchers and Clara at the table, she had set something in his face, did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, something that was briefly and quietly at ease. She handed him coffee. He took it and sat where she indicated at the end of the table beside Roy, and the room settled into the particular comfort of people who have found their places. The water discussion took an hour and went better than Clara had planned. She laid it out plainly: access to Bacon Creek irrigation at a rate 40% below what Hatch had charged, with a fair use agreement that protected the creek's flow and required cooperative maintenance of the shared ditches. She did what May had advised. She framed the practical details as questions, rather than proposals, letting Price and Wakefield arrive at the sensible conclusions themselves. Price was the harder of the 2, a man with a weathered skepticism earned through years of being on the short end of arrangements made by people with more power than him. He sat with his arms crossed for the first 20 minutes and listened without speaking. Then he asked 2 precise questions about the maintenance obligations, which told Clara he was serious about the arrangement and needed to understand the obligations before he could trust the benefits. She answered both questions directly and without softening the obligations. That was the moment his arms came down from his chest. "You're not going to change the rate next year," he said. "I'll give you a written agreement with a fixed rate for 3 years," Clara said. "After 3 years, we renegotiate both parties at the table, nobody holding water access as a lever." Wakefield, who had been quieter than Price, said, "Hatch would never have offered a written agreement." "I know," Clara said. "That's the difference." Roy looked at his coffee cup and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. By the time the dishes were cleared, both Price and Wakefield had agreed in principle and would come back Monday with Roy to sign the written terms Gideon would prepare. Clara watched them shake hands across her table in her house, and felt the specific satisfaction of something built correctly beginning to function. June Calder helped with the dishes while the men talked by the stove, and she worked beside Clara with the easy efficiency of a woman who does not believe in standing on ceremony when there are practical things to be done. "Roy said you were the most clear-headed person he'd seen in a courtroom," June said, drying a plate. "Roy was the most important person in that courtroom," Clara said. "He told the truth when he didn't have to." "He did have to," June said simply. "He just didn't know it until you asked him." She set the plate down and looked at Clara directly. "You're good for this town. I want you to know that someone sees it." Clara held that for a moment. It was a small thing. It landed like something large. "Thank you, June," she said. Roy and June left at 8:30, and Price and Wakefield not long after, and the house went from full and warm to quiet and warm with the stove still going, and 2 cups of coffee on the table, and Ethan Cole still in his chair. He hadn't rushed toward the door when the others rose. He'd helped Roy with his coat and shaken Wakefield's hand, and then stood at the table and looked at Clara with the quiet question of a man who will leave immediately if indicated and is not going to make the asking her responsibility. "Stay a while," she said. He sat back down. For a few minutes they didn't talk. The fire worked in the stove. The creek ran outside in the dark. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and have arrived at a place past the need to fill the space with words. A silence that had weight and warmth and no discomfort in it at all. "The territorial prosecutor sent a second letter," Cole said after a while. "Hatch's lawyers filed a motion to separate his case from Puig's. They're arguing he had no knowledge of the fraudulent will." "Does anyone believe that?" Clara said. "The prosecutor doesn't," Cole said. "But belief and evidence are 2 different things, and Hatch has spent 30 years making sure the evidence points at other people." He paused. "It may take longer than we'd like." "It will take as long as it takes," Clara said. "I'm not going anywhere." Cole looked at her over his coffee cup. "No," he said. "I don't think you are." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the stove and thought about what it had taken to arrive at this specific moment. This room, this warmth, this man across the table, this land outside in the dark that was entirely and legally and irrevocably hers. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The night Hatch stopped me on the road, when you were standing across the street. How long had you been there?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he said. "You'd been following me." "I'd been watching the road between the laundry and Maze," he said carefully. "Hatch had been in the saloon for 2 hours. That's a particular kind of waiting. You knew he was going to approach me." "I thought it was likely." Clara looked at him. "You could have warned me." "I could have," he said. "But a woman who has been warned that a man might approach her walks differently, more cautious, more obviously supported. I thought you were better served by walking exactly as you walked and having the situation resolved the way it was resolved." He paused. "I may have been wrong. You should have had the choice." The honesty of that, the willingness to say, "I may have been wrong" without qualification, did something to the inside of Clara's chest that she noted and set aside for later. "You weren't wrong," she said. "But I'll take the choice going forward." "Yes," he said. "Going forward." The phrase sat between them with a meaning neither of them examined directly, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He left at 10 o'clock, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride out, and then she closed the door and stood in the warm quiet of her own kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of the evening. The water arrangement. June Calder's words, the 2 cups on the table, the specific comfort of a man who had said going forward and meant something by it. She was not a woman who moved quickly toward things she wanted. She had learned early that wanting something too openly was a way to lose it, that the safest position was always one of managed expectation. But she was discovering not the same woman who had boarded a stagecoach in Cincinnati, with a contract pressed against her chest like a shield, and terror running underneath every practical calculation she made. That woman had survived. This woman had built something. The difference mattered. 3 weeks later, the first real snow came, and with it, a development that no one had predicted. Farley Birch, in the process of cooperating with the territorial prosecutor's investigation, produced something he had been holding back, a letter written in Hatch's hand, dated 2 weeks before Thomas Bycombe's death. The letter instructed Pruitt to prepare the prior will document and hold it ready. It referenced the marriage contract by name. It referenced Clara Whitmore by name. It said in Hatch's precise banker's language that the arrival of the Cincinnati woman would need to be managed efficiently if the property transfer was to proceed as planned. Clara was at Gideon's office when he showed it to her. She read it twice. Then she set it down carefully on his desk. "He knew my name before I arrived," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. "He had been planning this since before Thomas died. Since before I left Cincinnati." The letter was written on October 1st, Gideon said. Thomas signed his legitimate will on October 2nd. Whether Hatch knew about that will or merely suspected Thomas might take protective action, we don't know. But the preparation was already underway. Clara looked at the letter, at the clean formal handwriting of a man who had written her name on a piece of paper as a problem to be solved before she even knew this town existed. She thought about the stagecoach, the Kansas prairie, the hard biscuits, Thomas Bycombe dying while she was in transit, not knowing any of it. "This ends it," she said. "For Hatch. This letter ends it." "Yes," Gideon said quietly. "I believe it does." The territorial prosecutor received the letter the following week. Hatch's Denver lawyers filed 3 motions in rapid succession, all procedural, all designed to suppress or delay. The prosecutor denied all 3. Hatch was formally charged on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, the news had moved through Dust Hollow, the way news moved through small towns fast, and total leaving nothing unchanged. Clara heard it from Holt, who heard it from Price, who had ridden in from his ranch specifically to tell people. She was at the fence line when Holt came out with the information, and she listened, and then she went back to the fence post she'd been working on and set it with both hands and tested it. Solid. "All right," she said, and moved to the next one. Cole came by that evening. She had expected him. She had started a pot of coffee when she heard the horse, which told her something about how well she had learned to recognize the particular sound of his approach. He came in and sat, and she poured, and neither of them said anything about the charges for a moment. "He'll fight it," Cole said. "He'll lose," Clara said. "Probably not this year." "I know." She sat across from him. "I've stopped measuring time in days. I'm measuring it in seasons now. I'm thinking about the south pasture drainage before spring. I'm thinking about the water agreement renewals 3 years out." She paused. "I have time to let the court move at its own speed." Cole looked at her with the direct warmth that had replaced his early watchfulness. The same eyes, the same steadiness, but opened now the careful distance between observation and engagement, closed to something much smaller. "You came here terrified," he said. It wasn't a judgment. It was a statement of fact, offered as the beginning of something. "I was terrified from the moment I stepped off that stage," Clara said. "I was terrified every day for 3 weeks. I was terrified on the stand." She paused. "I was terrified the morning of the ruling, and I didn't know until afterward when it was done how much of me had been braced for losing." "What happened when you stopped being afraid?" Cole asked. She thought about that honestly. "I didn't stop being afraid," she said. I stopped letting the fear be the loudest thing in the room. He nodded. Something in the nod told her he understood this from the inside, not just as an observation about her. "What are you afraid of?" she asked, because the question had been moving toward the surface for weeks, and she was no longer a woman who avoided questions simply because the answers might be complicated. Cole looked at his cup. The fire worked in the stove. Outside, the snow had stopped and the night was very clear and cold. "I'm afraid of this county becoming what Hatch wanted it to be," he said. "A place where the people with water and money make every decision and everyone else adjusts." He paused. "I've watched it move that direction for 4 years, and I haven't been able to stop it with a badge and a set of laws that Hatch knew better than I did." "Until now," Clara said. He looked up. "Until now," he said. "Because someone arrived with a contract and a spine and no intention of being moved. We did it together," Clara said. "You and me and Gideon and Roy and Bess and June and everyone who told the truth when it cost something to do it." "Yes," Cole said. "But you were the center of it, the thing everyone else organized around." She held his gaze. "Ethan, I came here to build a life. I didn't come here to be the center of anything." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you are." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been building across the past weeks, the careful distance that had been maintained while there was a legal battle, and a need for professional clarity, the unspoken understanding that whatever was between them had to wait its turn behind the work. The work was done. The turn had arrived. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said. She had said it to Cole before about the town, about the fight. She said it now with a different inflection aimed at something different, and they both understood the difference. Cole set down his cup and looked at her steadily with his whole face open, in the way she had only seen it twice before, unguarded, honest, and carrying something that had been kept carefully in check for a long time. "Neither am I," he said. That night, for the first time, he didn't leave at 10 o'clock. He stayed while the fire in the stove burned down to coals, and the night deepened outside, and the cold pressed against the walls of the house, and found no way in. They talked about Cincinnati, about what it had been like to grow up with nothing and learn to calculate every risk and make every resource last. About what it was like to watch a town you'd chosen slowly become something you hadn't chosen. About the small specific things, what Holt had said about the south pasture drainage, which of Price's questions had told Clara he was going to sign the way Roy Calder looked when he took the witness stand, and the country saw what kind of man he was. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing ease and found the real thing underneath. At some point, Clara made more coffee, and they drank it. And at some point after that, the conversation slowed into the comfortable quiet of people who have said the important things, and no longer need to fill the space between them. She was not afraid. That was the thing she kept returning to, the specific absence of the fear that had been her constant companion since the stagecoach, since Cincinnati, since longer than that, since a childhood that had taught her that safety was something other people had, and she survived without. The fear that had sharpened her and driven her and carried her through the hearing and the 900 miles and the 3 weeks of building a case out of almost nothing. It was gone. Not dulled, not managed, not overridden by necessity. Gone. Replaced by something that had its own weight and warmth, that she recognized as something she had not felt since she was very young, before she had learned that the world was not reliably safe. She felt safe, not because the danger was entirely past. Hatch was still fighting. The territorial court was still moving. The county was still adjusting to a shifted order. Not because she was protected. She had learned definitively that she did not need to be protected, that she could build protection into her own ground. Safe, because she was in her own house on her own land with a man beside her, who had chosen to be there without being asked, and had never once made her feel that his presence was a cost she would eventually have to pay. Safe because she had done the hardest thing she had ever done, and it had held. Safe because she had come 900 miles terrified, and had arrived somewhere she hadn't known she was looking for. When Cole finally rose to leave hours past his usual time, he stood for a moment in the way of a man making a decision that is not difficult but is significant. "Friday," he said. Friday, she agreed. Not supper with ranchers this time. Both of them understood that. He put on his hat and she walked him to the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment, with the cold air between them and the dark land behind him and the warm house behind her. "I'm glad you got on that stagecoach," he said. Clara looked at him, this patient, steady, honest man who had stood at the back of every room until she needed him at the front, and she felt something settle in her chest with the finality of a fence post driven to bedrock. "So am I," she said. He rode out into the Colorado dark, and she closed the door against the cold, and she stood in the warm quiet of everything she had built and everything she had found, and she was not afraid, and she was not alone, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Clara Bycombe had come to Dust Hollow terrified with nothing but a contract and her own unbreakable will, and she had turned both into a life that belonged entirely and permanently to her.